I'd like to start by asking you all a question. Have you ever felt a tug to do something or to be somewhere? A tug that persisted without you really knowing why? Hands up. Anybody have that experience? Yeah. A tug can start from a meeting, a conversation, a book, a movie, or even a dream. One of my favorite films is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Has anybody seen it? Anybody remember that film? Anybody like it? Yeah? Well, in the film, Richard Dreyfuss has a close encounter. And from then on, something begins tugging at him. A feeling that he needed to be somewhere, but he knew not why. He had to go there, but he just knew he did. He couldn't shake it. So here's the story of my tug. In 2001, I met an extraordinary woman. Her name is Lisa Foreman, and she happens to be on Zoom this day with us. Lisa's eldest son had passed away 2 years before, and Lisa and her younger son David were going to Spain that year to walk a pilgrimage called the Camino de Santiago, also known as the Way. Lisa stayed in touch with me during her pilgrimage by email, and that communication between her and I impacted me in a way that I just couldn't shake. The Camino, as many call it, is one of the most walked pilgrimages in modern times. The pilgrimage consists of a network of routes that expand across all of Europe, and they all converge at one final destination, the ancient city of Santiago de Compostela. It's believed that the remains of St. James the Apostle are interned there in its cathedral or in the area. And what's interesting about this pilgrimage is that this pilgrimage has been walked, though this has been a Christian pilgrimage for about 1,000 years. For thousands of years prior, it was a pagan pilgrimage that had been walked by Druids and Romans to a final destination by the sea called Finisterre, which also translates as end of the earth. There were multiple pagan beliefs that drove people to this destination. One of them being that the sun would commit suicide every evening at one end of the earth and be reborn every morning on the other end of the earth, which is Finisterre. So ever since I remotely accompanied Lisa on her journey, there has been a tug in me to do it as well. And my plan was to go there when I retired, but in 2017, I couldn't wait any longer. I knew in a few years it would be time for me to change my career. I knew I was ordained and I knew I wanted to be a minister and to serve in some way, but I had no idea what that would be. And in my busy life, I was feeling like a human doing rather than a human being anymore. And I needed time and space away from that life to figure out what the answer was for the life to come. So on September 22nd, which was actually Lisa's son Josh's birthday, her son who had passed, I landed in Spain, carrying Josh's photo with me to walk as much of the Camino I could in 10 days. My goal was 145 kilometers. Besides Josh's photo, I had also brought along 65 small envelopes that said, "You are loved," written on them, with a heartstone necklace in each to share with people that I met along the way, if I felt they might be of need of these. The tug that brings many to the Camino is a tug of struggle. As I landed and prepared for the journey, I received things that we needed to carry along our way. One is a pilgrim's passport, which is a passport that you need to have stamped twice a day along your journey and this passport is presented to the officials in Santiago when you complete, so that you'll receive a certificate recognizing you as a pilgrim that has completed this pilgrimage. I also had we all get a shell. We pick up a shell from somewhere and we carry it on the back of our backpack to indicate that we are pilgrims and for people to know who we are and what we're doing. So on the first day, as I was leaving a guest house to start my journey, the owner of the guest house came over and sweetly wrapped his arms around me and wished me buen camino with tears in his eyes. And that was the beginning. Galicia, Spain has a rhythm in how it accompanies pilgrims. You soon realize into the experience that you're not walking alone. There are groups of pilgrims alone like me, or in groups, but they're all strangers. But we're all in it together. The trip quickly opens up your heart to the awareness of the unity of humanity and our inherent interconnectedness. The road is littered with relics, ancient relics, and remains of sacred sites, churches, and along the road you'll also find pop-up memorials where people have left trinkets and cards and notes and small mementos to their loved ones. Sometimes people they're separated from. Maybe people that had passed, but all loved ones somehow. I saw the experience of this trip as having three parts. One, to process pain, two, to offer comfort to others, and finally, to share joy. A common question shared among pilgrims on the path as you break bread or share a meal was, what brought you here? Why are you walking? Every day was a different landscape, some rich with ancient woods, others long, hot, dry, unforgiving asphalt roads. But every day was different. But to my surprise, every day was also different inside. So many of you know me and have come to know me, at least through this congregation. And I have kind of a bright personality. I'm pretty happy and positive most of the time. I love hiking. I love the woods. And I'm good by myself. So I was under the impression that as I went on this pilgrimage that this might sound corny, but I thought in my mind I'd be kind of singing zippity doo dah, as I happily walked along these roads by myself. And that wasn't what happened. I found that my inner experience was one of two opposites. I cycled from feeling joy to feeling deep sadness. One day I would walk along meeting people, maybe sharing a meal, and having deep connections. And the next day, maybe the following day, I would be working through the things I thought I left far behind in my soul and in my heart. The struggles of my life, the regrets of my life. I would wrestle my inner critic, and I struggled. I struggled in a way I didn't expect to. Like a deep, deep time in therapy, or it was a deep dive within in dealing with my darkness. And I understood why pilgrimage was an inner journey. I faced my darkness, and I sensed the scriptural stories of Christ or Buddha, who both on their sacred journeys were required to face darkness. It's much like the idea of Joseph Campbell's archetype of the journey. It's never smooth or easy, but it's always worth it for the transformation that comes in the end. And then on to another day, yet back to joy, a new meal, and another stranger, and a long conversation, or a day of silence. People didn't discuss or talk about their corporate jobs, or about what they owned, or what car they drove, or what were they going to buy next week. They talked about the present moment. They talked about who they loved. Conversations were about How are your feet? Do you have blisters? How are you taking care of them? Have you had a good meal? I met amazing people along the road. Younger people, older people, a mix of dozens of languages and cultures. People that were atheists, people that were Catholic, people that were Buddhist, people that were spiritual, not spiritual. Towards the end of the trip, the evening of the 8th day, I became very ill. I arrived at a guest house that afternoon and realized I had a fever of 103 and dysentery. Fortunately, I was blessed by the kindness of a couple who owned the guest house. Neither spoke English, but they did all they could to help me. The gentleman, after a night where my fever didn't break, the gentleman got up the next morning and drove me to a hospital who would not offer me care because I didn't have insurance. Then he got me to a pharmacy that spoke English, and he helped me to purchase the medication I needed for help to get through it. And then he was kind enough to drove me to the next guest house I had scheduled many miles down the road, so I could stay and recover. What an angel he was. It is said that the Camino is lined with angels. I spent that day and night fasting and sleeping to shake whatever this was that I had caught. And well, I didn't completely shake it, but I did get up that last morning, that 10th morning, to walk the longest day of my journey, the 12 miles into Santiago, to complete it. This was a tough day. I didn't feel very well at all. But a funny story about that endless day is that at some point I met a townsperson in one of the small towns I walked through, and I asked him, he not speaking English that well, and me and my broken Spanish, how many kilometers to Santiago do you know? And he responded, sí, 9 kilometers. I said, gracias. Buen camino is the greeting. Everybody exchanges, and off I go. And then I walk, I don't know how many more kilometers down the road, another hour or two, and I meet another townsperson. I ask him the same question. Do you know how many kilometers to Santiago? He said, sí, 9 kilometers. So it seemed truly endless. But sweetly off I went, and I finished. I arrived in Santiago that day, and it was done, and I was exhausted mentally, physically, and emotionally, and very, very overjoyed. The next morning, I received my compostale, confirming completion of the pilgrimage. I showed them, I presented to them my pilgrim's passport, and I could show you that right now. This is it. You can see it is covered with stamps that I received all across Spain. And this is the compostale that we pilgrims receive when we complete it. I attended a mass that day also at the cathedral and saw the incense burner, the gigantic incense burner that's called a botafumera, which is at least 3 feet high, that swings across a cathedral. And there are, I don't know if there are any that large in the world, but it's really quite dynamic to watch. And people that were exhausted, some weeping, realizing many walked hundreds and hundreds of miles, maybe 500 miles to get to this destination. I did a brief, a short version of the Camino. I was grateful. Oh yes, and then finally I traveled to Finisterre to complete my journey at the end of the earth. I was worn out. I was transformed. I had meetings with strangers along the way that I will never forget, and that were beyond what could ever have been a coincidence. A pilgrim travels 2 paths simultaneously, and they must pay attention to them both. When we place ourselves on the pilgrim's path, we sow the intention to stretch and expand soul consciousness so that we can lift ourselves out of the mundane in order to journey back to God, or whatever name we give that nameless, that is where we come from, or maybe we are just journeying back to ourselves, to our true selves, who we really are. In creating this service, I reached out to my pilgrim friends who have also walked the Camino, and I asked them, what were the tugs that brought you on this journey? And what in the end was your story? What affected you? And here is Lisa's story, the person who inspired me. She shared, and I abbreviated some of her thoughts here, that she had read, she said, I found The Camino by Shirley MacLaine, and I read that in 1998, and it haunted me. And I didn't stop thinking about it, and something told her to do this. And in September of 1999, she said, my son Joshua took his life, and deep within, I thought that walking this would be a way to grieve, especially with my other son, David. And she shares that truthfully, my biggest transformation from this journey, other than realizing that Joshua would be with me forever, was the fact that I can live with very little, that things were not important. Rather, being in nature, looking at the sky and trees and the flora is what is so important to me, even more now, today, 20 years later. And here is Beatrice's story, who is also with us today in this service. Beatrice also read the book by Shirley MacLaine, and she put the story in the back of her head. But she didn't give the Camino another thought for many years. And 10 years later, thanks to corporate downsizing, she shared that she lost her job. And it was interesting to note that she was wrestling with being unemployed. And the Camino started to formulate in her mind. And so it was then that she decided to go, that the tug pulled her. And as she started to walk, she felt infused with a sense of purpose and connectivity of participating in something that was connected to the divine and humanity in general. She also shares that though she has left the Camino far behind, the Camino will always live inside of her. And there is another pilgrim, Karen, who shared her story. And she shared, and she's not with us today, and she shared that for her, and this is interesting, it's a different pull. She said she was at the lowest she had ever been in her life, and the call came literally in a loud, clear voice that woke her from a deep sleep, where there was no one else around who could have spoken the word Santiago. And she was not familiar with the pilgrimage, never even heard of it. And she thought when she woke up, if that still was with her in the morning, she'll look into it. And she did. And she went. And she said, yes, I had a life-changing transformation as I worked. I learned that I couldn't forgive or forget the faults of others until I learned to forgive myself, to love myself. And I wound up learning to open myself up to the universe in its grand beauty and mystery. And my story, well, you know how my story started. I wanted to know what I was going to do with my life. And what came to me was this answer. It was to go back to work, Sonia, and love as hard as I could. To love my coworkers and to break rules. I broke rules at my job. That tends to be a quality of who I am. I would hug people and tell them I love them at a corporate environment. It's not always acceptable, but it worked for me, and it worked for my job. And share my kindness however I could, and to make my life my ministry and let it all unfold. And that's what I've done. So, as we come to this end, I ask you all, what have been the tugs in your life? What have been your callings, those things that have nagged at you to do that you're not quite sure where it came from? A pilgrimage does not have to be a trip to a far-off land. And that tug does not have to be pulled in the form of a pilgrimage. It could be a pull to social justice. It could be a pull to art in a way to inspire and help others. It could be whatever it is that deepens your experience with what you might deem sacred or spiritual or your true self. But that tug is a part of most of our lives, and it's a deepening experience to recognize it for yourselves. So I invite you to consider what those have been for you. And I'd like to close with these words from Rumi. The beloved is with you in the midst of your seeking. He holds your hand whenever you wander. May it be so. If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.